I'm Doug Austin. I'm the CEO and founder of UPD Consulting. We're a public sector management consulting company working mostly in the K-12 education space, helping organizations with preparing for and implementing their most difficult change initiatives. I'm glad that you all joined us today for a great discussion we're hoping to have with some district leaders and colleagues from around the country, and how they're engaging families and their community stakeholders in the developing of their ESSER plans and other critical initiatives that they've got going on at this moment. Our discussion today is going to focus on how we turn stakeholders into champions of the work that we're trying to accomplish, and how we do that in a way that builds deep and authentic community ownership and buy-in across diverse communities. From all of your poll responses, we can see that there's a lot of varied and broad understanding of the words education stakeholders, and we hope to get into a good conversation about that today. In keeping with our commitment at UPD to actively working on anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're going to focus some of our time on how we engage those that are typically the hardest to meaningfully engage in this kind of conversation. I'm going to take just a few minutes first to introduce our esteemed panel members who are joining us from three very different places from across the country. Janelle Ephraim is the Chief Equity Officer at the Vancouver Public Schools in Washington. Janelle is a lifetime educator and education leader. She was appointed the inaugural Chief Equity Officer of the Vancouver Public Schools just this past July 2020, after 15 years as a Vancouver Public Schools school administrator. And prior to that, Janelle was an adjunct professor at Portland State University. She began her career as a teacher in the North Clackamas School District in Oregon, and we're glad to have her here today. Say hello to Janelle. We have Tiffany Grant, who is the former Chief of Staff and District Diversity Officer of the San Antonio Independent School District in Texas. She is now the Deputy Director at Unlocking Potential, UP Partnership, a collective impact organization in San Antonio. Tiffany is a native San Antonian, a proud Texas Aggie, and a diehard Spurs fan. Tiffany has over 10 years of experience in school district executive administration. She also spent nearly a decade in corporate and community relations before entering public education. And prior to joining a partnership, Tiffany served as the first Chief of Staff of the San Antonio ISD. And she's currently completing her doctorate in education administration with a dissertation focused on the discipline disproportionality of girls of color. Say hello to Tiffany. And last but not least is Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez. She's the superintendent of the Hartford Public Schools in Connecticut. Dr. Torres Rodriguez is the superintendent of the Hartford Public Schools, one of the largest urban school districts in Connecticut. Raised in Hartford and a product of the Hartford Public High School, Leslie served as the education leader in Greater Hartford for over 2 decades. Recently, she was a recipient of the 2019 Connecticut Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, their award for educational leadership, the 2019 National Briante Award for Educational Excellence from Prospanica, and she was featured in Women of Distinction by Hartford Magazine in December of 2019. And she's also a fellow of the Broad Academy for Urban School System Leaders. So say hello to Leslie. Now we've had the idea for this panel for quite some time, and particularly given what has happened in this country over the last couple of years, we really wanted to bring us all together to have a conversation about the new stakeholder engagement in education. To frame this from my own perspective, I was previously the chief of staff of the Baltimore City Schools at a time when we were going through a massive reduction in space. Baltimore City is a city that at one point had about 900,000 people in population, and over the course of about 20 or 30 years, that population shrunk to about 600,000. And over the course of that time, the city schools had never closed a school building. We were faced with having our facilities funding cut by the state unless we reduced our footprint. And so we went through a year-long process to engage the community and help us decide how we were going to shrink, what the new district was going to look like, and with a commitment of making sure that every school building that the students from closed buildings attended would be better than the school that they left. Now, this was a massive endeavor, and typically the way that these decisions have been made in other districts around the country, and Baltimore was typical as well, was that the decisions were made in the central office. They were rolled out after the fact to the community to try and gain buy-in after the fact, and people sort of saw through that process and recognized that that's not really engagement. And so when we had to reduce the footprint of Baltimore City Schools, we committed to doing a year-long process of really involving the community in that engagement process. And those of us who designed the model and enacted it over the course of that year saw it also as an opportunity to really change the way that engagement is done generally, not just for that one initiative. And so looking back at this past year and the upheaval that the country has experienced after the murder of George Floyd, after the very difficult circumstances of having to close and then reopen schools because of a worldwide pandemic, and the need really to engage our community through these events. I'm curious about the way that you all might be looking at sort of the new engagement process as a way to totally change and redesign the way that we interact with our stakeholders generally. So I'd like to ask the first question of Tiffany. How have you engaged with your stakeholders, really sort of to close the loop with them during the pandemic?
Well, prior to the pandemic, and you've alluded to this, Doug, easy ways to talk to stakeholders. And when I think of stakeholders in the district, I think of the folks that we are there to serve directly, and that's children and their families. We would host town hall meetings where we would bring families and students together in, boundaries throughout the district, and we'd share information on bond issues or big initiatives that were coming to the district that were there to serve kids and their families. And so during the pandemic, that became very tough to do. We all had to retreat to a virtual space. And that was a scary time because in a district like SAISD, where there are very high levels of poverty amongst our families, our biggest concern was how we would connect to them. The amazing thing about working for Pedro Martinez and the unified board at SAISD is they were already thinking about what was happening up north before we saw it coming to Texas. And so we were able to order technology spring break before the pandemic really hit. And so we were putting laptops in families' hands, but guess what? What good is a laptop if you don't have Wi-Fi? And so we started mobilizing Wi-Fi units. And so one thing we started thinking about is how do we reach families that, are hard to reach and are going to be even harder to reach in a pandemic when everybody's indoors. So we started forming committees. The first committee that we formed was around our parents. We worked with all of our principals to nominate parents to serve on a district-wide parent committee. That parent committee became really the first line of defense before we vetted anything. As opposed to in prior years when we'd have ideas and we'd have them fleshed out and we took them to parents on the back end, we actually introduced things to parents on the front end and went to them and said, hey, you're in this with us, you're going through this with us, you have kids at home for the first time. How do you want us to engage with you? And so we went to families first. We did the same thing with our kids. We had a student advisory committee made up of leaders across the district. We said, okay, this is only a small portion of our babies. How do we reach larger numbers? We mobilized our kids to do that. And so I'll dig in a little deeper, but I want to start there, Doug, we really started using everything at our disposal: virtual town hall meetings, parent and student committees, social media, pláticas, which were small, intimate meetings with families based on their comfort level, mask and hand sanitizing and social distancing required. We started working with churches and community organizations that we knew our families trusted. We wanted to reach them any way that we could. And so those are a few examples, Doug, and I'm happy to dig in a little deeper if needed.
Sure. Leslie, if I could turn to you, the school districts grappled with the decisions around reopening in many ways, like they're being pushed and pulled in all different kinds of directions, from families themselves and teachers to the politicians in the localities and states and even nationally. How did you engage your stakeholders and build trust with them to sort of have confidence in your reopening decisions?
Yeah, there were several moves, but I'll just offer it first to some initial context, right? Our priority always was, despite the push that was coming from many different angles, to have as much in-person learning as possible. And so for those that opted in, we did start the year with a fully in-person, learning model. We did shift to hybrid November through March, and then mid-March we were, the option to have everyone fully back in was made available. And overall, right, we created just more opportunities to get information and feedback from our community and partners and families faster. We grounded our choices, similar to what Tiffany was describing. We grounded our choices in what our students and our families were telling us. So some examples: added more opportunities for the district to listen we did surveys. We relied initially a lot on our surveys, our focus groups, smaller focus groups, and even the one-on-one conversations, our nearly 6,000 home visits compared to like 2,000 in prior years were, a significant source of information for us around what was working, what were the needs, and how we could leverage our community partners to support us in that work. The frequency, I know this sounds like, it's just common sense, right? Frequency, but for us, increasing the communications frequency and multiple formats allowed us to just reinforce the key messages. The town halls, not only for families, but for our staff. We found that, staff became and just an added layer in terms of voice, getting the voice and information and coming back to us. And so internal two-way structures for communication to flow back and forth. We also, to ensure, to maintain our commitment to equity, we wanted to make sure that we were sharing back what it was that we were hearing, what the feedback was as to what's working, what's not working, what do we want more of, and how the feedback was actually showing up in our plans, right? That we heard about mental health supports that our students and our families needed. And to build trust and investment in sharing the feedback, we wanted to make sure that we shared back the results of what we were hearing through multiple means. Now, our social media was of course a lever, but media in general became a go-to for us. I mean, we would call our media, we would call, pressers, and they would show up immediately. And so it just became routine practice for us. One other thing that I'll share is just transparency. around just health and safety data and the decision making. We published our plans. We kept our live dashboard up for the entire community to see every single day, right? How many cases, how many quarantines we were having. And there were some things that we learned. One is just a few classic engagement and communication best practices that are especially important even right now. One is to be aware of survey fatigue. We learned that one. Asking for lots of input can actually reduce stakeholder investment, especially if you're not showing that what they've already told us is being used. We learned that repetition was so important. Folks were processing, as you can imagine, right? They were inundated with information. And so hearing something several times really was helpful in getting it to stick. And then the transparency piece, right? I know it's not enough on its own, just to share the information, but making the information digestible in a way that sticks for people, almost kind of lessened, some level of anxiety, and, kept folks informed and willing and able to, inform the plan and the response.
Right. At UPD, we always use human-centered design and even design justice principles as a way of engaging our stakeholders and the stakeholders of our clients, particularly as it relates to getting sort of the harder to reach members, people who don't normally show up or who organizations have not had a good track record of reaching out to and including in the planning processes. Janelle, over the past year or so, Vancouver Public Schools has gone through an equity assessment and collecting a lot of information and analysis towards reshaping the organization's strategic plan through an equity lens. And I'm curious about some of your experience and the experience of your organization as it relates to really putting equity front and center in the way that you engage folks. What worked and what didn't work so well in that process?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we really focused on three main approaches. We had various approaches, but the three main approaches that we used was we created an equity advisory committee when we started the work. We conducted stakeholder surveys and we conducted focus groups and listening sessions. And with our equity advisory committee, it was, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so, everyone was trying to figure out how to best engage, particularly our marginalized communities. And so with our equity advisory committee, we focused on making sure that we had key leaders at the table. So working with our LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens, NAACP. We have the chair of our local Cowlitz Indian tribe on our committee, Consulate General for the Micronesian Islands. We have law enforcement. We have parents of students who have disabilities, as well as mental health workers. So we really tried to get a very wide perspective and folks who could share information about how students were experiencing our schools and how we as a school system could support students so that they could have better experiences in our schools. And so that was with the equity advisory. With our stakeholder surveys, we surveyed our staff, our parents, as well as our students. So all students 5th through 12th grade had an opportunity to participate in that. One of the things that we have historically been challenged with our parent surveys is really reaching parents who are bilingual. And so we had our interpreter translators make personal calls to families to encourage them to complete the survey. But one of the benefits of that that came out of that particular activity was that families had an opportunity to have personal conversations with someone from the school system so that they could ask questions. It could be questions around how to access the Canvas web page for their students. It could have been questions around how do we access food, just basic things that weren't necessarily connected to the survey, but families had a chance to access information. So that was really a plus that came out of those personal calls. And our focus groups and listening sessions. So our listening sessions really gave families an opportunity and staff members an opportunity to have one-on-one conversations about how they're experiencing our schools. And while I think that was a benefit as well as a challenge. And the reason when I speak to the challenges, I'm particularly talking about our focus groups around students. We had a difficult time engaging our students in focus groups. I'm sure it had something to do with the fact that they were on Zoom all day, and then we asked them to, get on Zoom again. But there were some lessons learned in that. I think one of the lessons was that we've got a lot of work to do as far as engaging our students in a continuous feedback loop. If we, and so that's something that post-pandemic, or I don't know that we're post-pandemic yet, but post-pandemic, and I guess as we are in the middle of the pandemic, we are really focusing on how do we engage our students so that it's continual, so that when we get into situations where we really want their feedback, we're not trying to find them. They're already engaged and significant decision, or being a part of making significant decisions in our system.
Okay, Janelle, are there things that through that process that surprised you about how the staff, the leaders within the Vancouver Public Schools either reacted or grew through that process? Any insights that you can provide about how the organization might have changed?
I think our leaders were, everyone in our system, we were trying to figure out how can we reach our students. We were missing kids, right? Because we're accustomed to having them with us every day. And so everyone was pretty passionate about trying to figure out how to best do that. It was encouraging because with us starting our equity initiative, it was before the pandemic hit. And so it was encouraging just to see the energy around how our employee base, how we were all passionate about how we can really enhance the student experience in our district. And so it was nice to see how people are rallying around that for kids.
Great. Tiffany, I'm interested if you have reflections on some of what Janelle has been talking about, particularly I think as it relates to the hardest to reach stakeholders, just from your experience in San Antonio in the school district, but also in your new role as well.
Absolutely. Like Janelle said, we were missing our babies, and we knew that there were kids that were not reporting to school that we couldn't find. So we really empowered our staff just to come up with their best thinking. That led to home visits during a time when they weren't necessarily encouraged, but we gave staff some ideas on how to do that, how to buddy up, how to create distance between them and the house that made the parents feel safe. But just making a phone call, having them come outside and say, hey, we're missing Johnny. Is there a way that we can connect with him? And that we started to gain some traction there. To Leslie's point earlier around the surveys, using that as a springboard. But then we found out parents don't understand the applications that we're using. They needed training on Zoom. So our tech team said, hey, let's create a parent tech hotline. We got so many calls from families just saying, hey, how can you help us connect? I got this Wi-Fi thing. I don't know how to get it connected to my computer. That began to just build the trust. Our buses and our food service teamed up to do SAISD Uber Eats. We stole the Uber idea, and we were delivering food on front porches. If we knew a family had COVID, we took the food to the doorstep to make sure that they were taken care of. The teachers were really a great line of defense too. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that our teachers made more parent calls than ever before. And the campuses and our back to office staff, to your question, Doug, about leaders, there was an all hands on approach. It didn't matter where you were in the system. If we needed to dial these 20 kids today, I would pick up the phone. I was calling kids. Everybody was reaching out to see what we could do to help. I'm talking to the city, our Spurs, our AT&T, our corporate companies in the city. How can you help? How can you help with Wi-Fi? These are the needs. And so really, it was just an all hands on deck approach. I think one thing that we learned, like you, Janelle, students were the hardest to reach, but they're the tech savvy group. And so we used our student leaders to connect to their classmates. And so we launched surveys through our student advisory committee, and we told them, work with your principal on how to incentivize completion. And in our first run, we had a couple of thousand responses from our kids, which helped to inform our reopening plan for this year. And while I'm no longer with the district, I'm still very much attached to them and supporting them in the new role. And a lot of the feedback loop that we created last year really helped to inform what they are using today. And so I think the all hands on deck approach and mobilizing any form of communication that we possibly could while getting feedback from parents really made the difference.
Great, great. Well, we know that engaging in these ways requires a substantial shift in the individual and organizational practices, habits, mindsets. And you all, as leaders, know how critical it is to be explicit in leading change processes. Otherwise, they don't actually happen. So I wanted to give some space to you all to share how you as leaders are strategically building capacity in your organization and developing the mindsets and approaches to these new times, so that it's not just a temporary thing, but more lasting. Leslie, I'm curious about your plans for future growth in your organization's capacity and your engagement capacity in particular, as you continue to navigate the pandemic, as your plans, and also all the recovery projects that are going to be enabled by some of the new funding coming out of Washington.
So first, I will share just a framework that we've begun to leverage that, of course, is grounded in equity, but it's helping us apply an equity lens to process, right? In terms of process, resource allocation, and the just strategies themselves. And so, I often tell my team, let's think about equity in the process, right? And the approach is, of course, what we just talked about. We talked about actively seeking voice and stakeholder voice to inform not just the design, not to inform just the decisions, but actually the design, right? So kind of coming back, circling and saying, okay, so this is what you've told us. Now it's time to come to the design table and bringing stakeholders, right, also to the design table. Of course, equity in resource allocation, and that's targeting our resources equitably, right, based on student need and school need. And then in terms of the strategies themselves, and from an internal perspective, one thing that I read a few years ago, the book Change or Die, which is an easily accessible, frame. And so that's the approach that, we're going to take to change management. There's you relate, you redo, and you renew. And so relating, it's just what we have to get back to, right? Making sure that we form these new emotional relationships with students, families, and even our staff and partners, which, gets to that level of hope that we know, hope doesn't obviously solve it, but we know that we need hope, right? To just believe that change is possible. And we also know that relationships, right? We need them to influence others and to influence behavior change. We know that our adults need them. And the relationships, also help with the continuous improvement efforts that that we want to engage in, right? That redoing of what it is that we learned last year. Because I don't know about you all, but we certainly learned a ton last year about what worked and what we want to carry forward and what it is that we actually already abandoned. We know that relationships support learning and repetition and the mastery of those new skills. And the health crisis and those shifts back and forth in learning models provided us an opportunity to just think about and do things very differently, right? Beyond technology is how we engaged. We know that we were doing it differently. And so I think we can learn a lot from those challenges as well as from the accomplishment and repeat and redo that I think will then lead to, right, that third R, the renewal, right? Relationships also promote new ways of thinking and seeing that lead to change. And so, some of the things that we're prioritizing that, are possible with the infusion of funding, example is expanding our community school model and framework, right? From 8 schools to 13 schools. We have a much smaller district, for example, that Tiffany you have or you had, and that means that we now will have added connection and access to our families before school, after school, on weekends, on intersessions, right? Intentionally so. And we've also expanded that to not just include the community-based providers, which were at the center of our approach during the response to the pandemic, but our faith leaders, right? Making them come even closer, allowing them to come even closer. We have additional investments, for example, in our parent and educator academy, which is gonna, entailing a bottom-up approach to advocacy and opportunities for parents. And we're extending that to allow for micro-credentialing, which is something that we heard from our families. We want to know how to get better at helping our students, but we also want to get better ourselves. And so again, leveraging, not just the funding for, these potential new initiatives, but setting us up for success beyond, right, the funding availability, and doing so in a way that it builds capacity at multiple levels of not just the organization, but the ecosystem, hence our parents, our families, our community providers.
Okay, excellent. Janelle, you have the opportunity and maybe challenge as well, being the first Chief Equity Officer in the Vancouver Public Schools. I like to point out to people when they see organizations sort of setting up new offices to address equity issues. In education, it's a little bit different, I think, because we have been at least trying to pay attention to the things like the achievement gap for a number of years. So this is not a new endeavor for most of us in public education. But I'm curious about your situation in this role as a new Chief Equity Officer, and excuse me, what do you see as sort of key to building out your vision of what this unit will do and how it will further the goals and objectives of the organization?
Yeah, so I really see 3 main pieces that we need to make sure that we keep in mind and that we do. That's engagement, meaning that continuous feedback loop, accountability, and enhancing the student experience, i.e. student learning, right? And so when I think about engaging families, we have had an opportunity to engage them for this past year with our equity audit, but our goal is to make sure that we continue that. And so the equity audit was really our first step in engagement, but we're putting systems in place so that we can have engagement opportunities where families are present with us and giving us feedback, and then we're reporting back to them on the decisions that we make together. I mean, and so those are kind of shifts in our system. Historically, we have made decisions for families, and then but we don't, that's not who we want to be, because we know that that's not how we're going to best support the families that we are called to serve. The accountability piece is our school board is working on a equity policy, and really that policy is going to support us in making sure that we do what we say we're going to do, right? That we engage our families in decision-making processes, that we hold our staff members accountable to the types of decisions that they make on a daily basis, that all of us make on a daily basis. And so that policy is going to be really key in our accountability. And then as far as enhancing that student experience, we've had the opportunity with some of the ESSER funds to hire equity coaches. And so those coaches are going to be working with our school leaders, as well as our teachers, paraprofessionals, really everyone in our system, as far as providing some training, providing direct coaching around what culturally responsive teaching looks like. And really what it looks like is students being able to learn at high levels, right? And so so those are some of the things that that we are keeping in mind as we move this equity work forward.
Okay. I want to give our audience members an opportunity to ask questions as well. And I'll ask you to, if you do have questions, to put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to some of them. In the meantime, I'd like to ask each of you if you could what advice would you have for district leaders around the country who are on their turf, trying to level up their efforts to engage meaningfully with diverse stakeholders? What advice would you give to them? Why don't we start with you, Leslie?
So I'd ask to identify any low-hanging fruit in terms of opportunities for that engagement, so that it is authentic. For example, for us, we had 50 hours of engagement around our ESSER and ARP applications, which we coupled with our strategic planning process. And boy, what a way for us to just leverage multiple voices and multiple stakeholders. And now we're able to say, this is our strategic plan. This is what you told us. This is how it's showing up in the student, the parent, the teacher experience. So leveraging the opportunity to engage in something that is actually tangible. And you can go back and say, this is what it's going to look like. And this is how, we're going to hold ourselves accountable, to Janelle's point, right, for delivering and executing on.
Tiffany, your advice to leaders out there?
I would say to also do an asset map of all of the partners within your district's boundary. San Antonio, we have 17 school districts, so there's a lot of opportunity to work with neighboring districts to help, with best practices or to avoid pitfalls. And so one thing I encourage organizations or districts to do is tap into the resources around you. Having worked in the school system, I'm now working with a collective impact nonprofit that actually supported the school district around restorative justice. And so a lot of the scale up that we did in the system was supported by way of professional development, tools, and actual coaches that went on campuses to help principals scale up how they disciplined and review how they discipline kids, and to make sure that they were doing that in a way that restored the child on campus. And so tapping into resources around, there's lots of nonprofits doing work. Districts are strapped in terms of resources at times. So seeing who's out there that's doing some of the things that you need and working with them to be able to better support your parents and your kids.
And Janelle?
Yes, coupled with what we heard from Leslie and Tiffany, I would just add that we make sure that we are listening to our students, that we are involving them in the process, because they have so many of the answers. And sometimes we can get caught up in adults and adult work, whereas our kids just really have so much wisdom that sometimes we forget to tap into. So I would say start with our students.
Well, I'm going to offer up my own, which is that you know, we often go into change initiatives with a lot of focus on the idea itself, and we often forget to pay enough attention to the fact that the folks that are working for you in the organization are also going through a change process. They may be bought into it, they may be 100% behind it, but it's still a change that they've got to learn and practice and adopt. And just a reminder, if you will, that that if you don't pay attention to that change that's going on, those folks are going to struggle and oftentimes may sort of fall off the wagon. And so continued attention to the dynamics of change within the organization, I think, is warranted in this work as well. It doesn't look like we have a whole lot of questions from our audience, so I'll open the floor up to the three of you and any questions you have for each other, and or other reflections that you have on the conversation that we've had this afternoon.
Doug, adding to what you said, because I know we have leaders from across the country on the call, taking care of staff is so important. They were living out the pandemic just like our families were. One thing that the district did that was amazing is, we were infusing a lot of social emotional supports for kids, but we were doing it for our staff on the back end. We held a speaker series on Sundays called PD and PJs. We brought thought leaders from around the country on issues of REI, disproportionality, and really just ignited our staff as they were dealing with the dual pandemics that they were seeing in terms of racism and the health crisis. And so they were frustrated and needed some encouragement too. So we had, amazing speakers that came and fired them up on Saturday mornings. And we had anywhere from 500 to 1,000 staff that would meet us for coffee and PJs to hear speakers like Dr. Gloria Latson Billings, Dr. Goldie Muhammad, Dr. Victor Rios, just amazing people. Dr. Monique Morris, who came and gave up their time to our staff. The other thing we did, just for fun, we held a virtual, for lack of a better word, clinic. I taught how to journal. I'm a journaler on the side, so had some fun with staff. We had barbecue lessons. Everything was virtual, how to garden, taking care of pets, reading time with kids. And we had staff and their kids lined up to read different books. I mean, it was an amazing day. And they spent a 6-hour period going from course to course. So finding creative ways to connect with your staff is important too, because they are so stretched and they were burdened during this time, just like our families were. And I think, we were concentrating our efforts on our babies, but not losing sight of the fact that our staff were coming down with COVID. They were dealing with family members who had, and so they were struggling during this time period too. And that connection really helped the district to just bind together as we work through the pandemic.
I appreciate you sharing the staff and the care piece, which we did a little bit of that around health and wellness, but we actually extended through our families. We had our Project Joy. We know we were trying to take care of and support our families. We were getting towards that, but we didn't want to lose the fun and the joy in kids and families. And so we partnered with local restaurants to offer a series of meals where we would have meals with our families, right? Either the restaurants would deliver, or, they could pick up the meals. And then we have, for example, salsa lessons, or there was a cooking, opportunity for families to do with their kids and one another. And, it allowed for us at the district to just get to know our families, and for families to get to know us, right, in a very different light. Some of our own, our children, were part of some of these, Saturday events with our families and their children. And it became another way for us to just share in the humanity of the challenge And the fact that, we just have to be extra intentional about finding the joy. And, of course, we leveraged our restaurants, which, at that time were also, struggling. And so to provide, 500, 600 meals from local restaurants was also a way for us to keep everyone connected. So your sharing around staff made me think about, the family piece and our Project Joy.
And I appreciate that about staff as well. I think, and I am encouraged to hear what you ladies are doing. Really, for us, I think it was it shined a pretty glaring light to say, hey, we need to do more for our staff, and so we had the opportunity to go through a social emotional learning adoption last year. And so, but because of the staff piece coming to light, we were able to adopt some curriculum that actually had components that address staff wellness. So that was a challenge and an opportunity.
Yeah, I think the theme of what all three of you have just spoken about is the sort of the people-centered aspect of this work. Change ultimately is about people changing ideas, changing relationships, changing process, changing practice. And as we've said, change doesn't just happen because we want it to. It has to be thought through, has to be managed just like anything else. We do have a question from Anthony. Has your work been impacted by any local legislation? And if so, how has that affected the equity work that you're doing in your communities?
As you know, Texas, we have seen a bubble up in the anti-CRT movement. And so as it pertains to racial equity work, I think that there are a lot of leaders across our city. I was the inaugural Chief Equity Officer for SAISD. I didn't know where to begin. So I called on every district to appoint a member of a committee. We started a citywide racial equity coalition alongside CEP. I see Suk in the room. And we brought leaders together to talk about racial equity and how it was moving in their district and to share best practices. We have seen some anxiety behind some of the legislation or the proposed legislation, but we're working through how to help districts reframe that discussion and really just share with families the importance of diversity and making sure that we are monitoring the results of all of our students and pivoting when we see disproportionality show up. So Anthony, to your point, we have seen an impact in Texas.
So for us, at the state level, there was legislation around Black and Latino studies, actually, to be embedded in our curriculum, work that we had already started. So we were a little bit ahead of the state legislation. And so we've not had significant pushback from others around, our equity work. I think now as we think about masks and mandates and vaccination mandates, I think there might be, I wonder whether there's going to be this confluence of or collision of events or, beliefs that we might have to think about. But thus far, no, unlike, Tiffany, as you were describing, in Texas and then in other states, right, that we're seeing.
To your point, though, Leslie, we were able to successfully adopt both Mexican American and African American studies courses in Texas, and SAISD is teaching those courses in several of our high schools. So super excited about that work.
That's awesome. So for us, our state passed legislation that actually requires us to train our K-12 staff in cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that support has been very timely because we do have pockets of our community that do have some concerns around the equity work, but we do have legislation that supports how we're moving forward with supporting kids.
Okay, Thank you for that. Sam has a question. He's wondering if the panelists have any advice about what not to do when attempting to assemble parents and student focus groups.
I can offer one. Don't assume that because you've assembled them before, that they are coming into the conversation or the space with background knowledge, right? Just take time to step back and create opportunity to say, so this is where we have been. This is what you've told us before. Just continue to ground the conversation in where were we, right? Just like we do with our staff, like where were we, where are we going?
Anyone else?
I think one thing we learned was bringing families in on the front end. You don't want to bring them in to a point where it feels like the plan's been already fleshed out and approved. In order for them to feel that their voice is being heard, bring them in on the front end. And so we had a district leadership team. We had 3 parents representing 50,000 plus families, our 50,000 plus students. We scaled that up significantly during the pandemic. And we used that parent committee to vet research requests, curriculum changes, the reopening plan, the safety protocol on the buses and in the classrooms. So bringing them in on the front end so that they don't feel like they're walking into something that you're just asking them to rubber stamp. And that's the same for kids, because kids can see straight through that and they're going to want to know who thought this out and was there a child at the table when it happened. So bringing them on the front end.
Yes, and I would just add, don't assume that everyone at the table is in support of the work. Be prepared for those who are opposed.
That's a really good point. I think I will add one, which is that this is work where there are no experts and everyone's an expert. And I think that in my experience, perhaps present company accepted, educators often have a difficult time admitting that. In situations where they are the authority in the room and they're the ones who are supposed to have the answers, just admitting that we don't necessarily know how to go about this work in a way that's going to work, that there's going to be a lot of trial and error, and it's still it's that is part of the process, and creating sort of the safe space for you and your staff members and those who you're attempting to engage to be able to say that openly. And it's particularly fraught in the area of equity. People don't want to get that wrong. They don't want to make mistakes in doing this work. But we have to be honest and transparent about our own journey in learning how to do this and learning what's going to work in our particular context, in our particular situation. So I think that's going into these meetings with the sort of the authority that we know what we're doing and we have all the answer. I think people are going to see that, they're going to take issue with it, and you're going to end up having to do a lot of backtracking and correcting if you take that stance. I think hanging out with you for this last hour and hearing your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for your time, and hope everybody has a great week.